So, you want to play Monster Hunter Wilds, but you're not sure what weapon to start out with. Well, in this video, I'll be breaking down the pros and cons of all 14 weapons in the game and hopefully help you figure out what weapon is the best for you and your playstyle. But first, a few disclaimers. Every weapon in Monster Hunter games has a high skill ceiling. While they all have a degree of mastery to them, many are easier to pick up and learn right away. I've used all these weapons in some degree or another in Monster Hunter World, as well as the beta for Wilds back in November, so I have some thoughts on which are the easiest to use. That being said, if you love to use a bow in every game you play, then just go with that and you will learn it quickly. If you love to be a support player in games, then do the hunting horn. And if you love high damaging attacks, then the greatsword or hammer will be your pick. With that out of the way though, let's take a look at the strengths and weaknesses of each weapon. So first up, let's look at the swords. I want to start with the sword and shield, as I think this is the classic beginner weapon. If you ever played Anthem, you'll know that there were 4 javelin suits. One was the quintessential tank known as the Colossus, another was the classic caster class in the Storm, then you had the quick and agile melee class in the Interceptor, and finally the jack of all trades but master of none in the Ranger. The reason I bring this up is because the sword and shield is basically like the Ranger. It doesn't excel in any one area, but it's decent at everything. You can guard with the shield, allowing you to mitigate damage and block an incoming attack. You can also use the shield for blunt damage attacks, which can build up KO on the enemy and lead to a knockdown. Conversely, you also have the sword, which is good for slicing attacks to maybe cut off a tail or to create a wound on the enemy, which is something that is very important in Monster Hunter Wilds. Lastly, this class has great mobility, which is really important for new players as it can be tough to learn the enemy movesets, so having a weapon with quick attacks will keep you from being in a compromised position that could get you killed. On top of this, you can also use some items while the weapon is drawn, something that most weapons can't do. Is this the strongest weapon in the game? Well, that remains to be seen, but judging off my time with it in the beta, I would say certainly not. But it is a great weapon if you want to just pick something up that is simple and easy to use. It doesn't require many complex combos or building up of meters. You just pick it up and will probably have some decent success with it right away. Even if it kills enemies slower than other weapons in the game, at least you won't be dying all the time. The sword and shield is a great beginner weapon in my opinion. Onto another slashing type weapon, we have one of my favorites in the dual blades. Something to know about Monster Hunter games is they most certainly are not button mashers. They all have somewhat complex combos and each weapon has a high skill ceiling to reach mastery with it. And if you do try and button mash, you will often just end up dead because precise timing is crucial in this game. That being said, if you were to button mash with any weapon in the game, then it would certainly be the dual blades. I mained Insect Glaive in Monster Hunter World, but the other weapon type that I played the most was dual blades. These are just a ton of fun. They have very low damage per hit, but they make up for it with being able to hit the enemy a ton of times over and over. They also have the best mobility of any weapon type in my opinion, allowing you to quickly weave in and out for attacks while dodging the attacks from the monsters. They do have a meter that you fill to enter Demon or Archdemon mode and complex combos that you can pull off. But out of the gate, for a beginner, these are very good to use as you can probably get away with just dodging and slashing constantly while really only having to worry about your stamina meter. This is good as it will allow you to familiarize yourself with the other complex systems in Monster Hunter without having to worry about timing your attacks on the enemy and performing complicated movesets to get the most out of your weapon. So for me, those are probably the best 2 options for any beginner. Like I said, they have fairly basic combat structure and are highly mobile, which is very important when you're new to the franchise. So if you just wanted the easiest weapon to pick up and do well with out of the gate, then those are my recommendations. But I do want to dive into the strengths and weaknesses of all the other weapons, because maybe you are familiar with the game but you haven't played in a while. So you understand the nature of combat in Monster Hunter games and you know how to recognize attack tells from the monsters and understand many monster mechanics. Well then, let's jump into what I felt was one of the strongest weapons in the beta, and that is the Greatsword. The Greatsword is heavy and slow and hits like a truck. I had so much fun using this thing in the beta. It does require good timing to get the most out of it though. And like I mentioned, you can't really button mash in these games. And since this weapon is so heavy and slow, if you do, you will probably just get hit by the enemy. But once you learn how to time your attacks, few weapons are stronger than the Greatsword. You can do a rising slash to counter an incoming monster's attack, which is awesome for counter and stagger play, and you can block with the sword to enter a clash, which is a new mechanic in Wilds. And you can charge up heavy attacks to unleash on a sleeping monster. You need good timing and good aim with this weapon, but the aim is pretty forgiving now with the new focus mode, helping to lower the skill gap on this weapon. I barely ever used it in previous Monster Hunter installments, but I found great success with it right away in Wilds. A very strong weapon indeed. From the Greatsword, we lead into the Longsword. I had a ton of fun with this weapon as well in the beta. It has a helm splitter attack that is a ton of fun to use and deals great damage. There's a charge meter on this one, but it's not too complex to get the hang of. It's got pretty decent mobility, allowing you to pretty easily dodge enemy attacks, but it does rely on counterplay quite a bit to make the most out of it, which does add a bit of a skill gap. Overall, it's just a really fun weapon to use. Next, we have the Switch Axe. It is an axe and a sword. You basically use the axe to charge up the sword, and then swap to sword and amp it up. In my opinion, this is not the easiest weapon to pick up and play. I had decent success with it in the beta, but it's not very beginner friendly since you want to be swapping between modes, requiring you to learn 2 types of playstyles. It is also a somewhat slow weapon to use, so it's not very mobile. It can hit quite hard, which is nice, but you have to know what you're doing to unleash its potential. For that reason, I don't think it's very beginner friendly, but it is definitely fun to use once you get the hang of it. Speaking of complicated weapons, next we have the Charge Blade. This is probably the most complex of all the weapons, and it's almost like 3 weapons in one. It has a sword and shield that can transform into an axe, and then you have a charge meter and files that you charge up. It is sort of similar to the Switch Axe in that you have to learn different attacks for different states of the weapon, and depending on the weapon you have, depends on your mobility. This will certainly take some getting used to, so probably not the best for beginners. It's probably best to wait to use this one until you're used to everything else in the game, so that when you're fighting monsters, you can be more focused on using the weapon, rather than worrying about everything else like monster attack patterns, or how to use a scroll wheel or your quick menu to get a potion quickly in the heat of battle. Like I said, there are many things to learn at once when you're new to the game, so probably best to settle on a simpler option out the gate. And that brings us to the final blade type weapon, which is my main from Monster Hunter World, the Insect Glaive. It received some changes since World, and some of them are not very well liked by the community, but overall, I think it still feels great in Wilds. You have a Kinsect that you have to shoot at the monster to leech a buff off of. This is not that difficult or very complicated to do, but it does add steps that prevent it from being at its maximum potency until you do this. But if you can get used to shooting the Kinsect, then the weapon is wonderful. I was drawn to it for the aerial style of gameplay, which I found fun and effective, as well as it being super easy to mount monsters. This weapon hits decently hard and is one of the most mobile playstyles in the game, which is great for survivability. Like I said, there is a bit of a skill gap with it for sure, from learning how to launch an attack from the air to using Kinsects, but back in 2018 when World released, I started with this weapon and caught on quite quickly, so I definitely think it can be beginner friendly. So now let's move on to the blunt damage melee weapons, starting with the hammer. This thing is very unwieldy, but it hits like a truck. If you like powerful attacks, then this weapon is for you. It is great at knocking down enemies and breaking monsters' parts, and it's awesome for delivering a powerful blow to a sleeping monster. Because it's so heavy though, you have to really time your attacks well, or you may just end up getting knocked out. As they say, dead DPS is no DPS, so this one can be a bit of a high risk, high reward pick. But if you can get good with it, you'll be knocking off monster body parts and knocking them out with ease. A weapon that is similar in attack pattern to the hammer is the hunting horn. This too is a blunt instrument that hits pretty slow and hard, but it has additional utility to buff you and your allies. So if you love to play a support role, then this is a natural fit. That being said, it will take some time to learn all the tunes and how it works so that you can use the buffs to their full potential. Because of this and its low maneuverability, it's not great for beginners, but this weapon has very high upside. Next up we have the Lance. This weapon is quite easy to use actually. You have decent mobility as well as a shield to guard from enemy attacks. It allows you to evade an attack with relative ease. It has decent range and, like I mentioned, inherent survivability thanks to its shield. So for a beginner weapon, this would be a good pick. It's quite safe to use so it will keep you alive, but you probably won't be out DPSing your teammates, which is fine. Thanks to its survivability, you could play the tank type role while your other teammates go to town with their weapons. And there's still a bit of a skill ceiling with it when it comes to perfect guards and things like that. It's just a very solid weapon. Not too flashy, but it gets the job done. A pretty good beginner pick. But next, we have a similar weapon, but a big step up in damage in the Gunlance. I was absolutely loving this thing in the beta. It too has a shield for some defensive capability, and what you gain in damage with this weapon, you lose in mobility. It's pretty heavy and slow to use, but if you can get used to it, this thing is a monster. I killed a Chatacabra in the beta with this thing in about 7 minutes solo. I was absolutely going to town on it. It can shell the enemies and deal big damage with the Drake Auger drill attack, among other things like the Wyvern Blast. In my opinion, it's one of the strongest weapons in the game. I didn't find it too difficult to get used to either. It felt pretty intuitive. But like I've mentioned, if you aren't used to the way Monster Hunter games play and the way enemies attack, then the slower, clunkier, heavy hitting weapons could just get you killed before you can get their big damage attacks off. But as far as the slow, heavy hitting weapons go, I found this one the easiest to catch on to quickly. And that brings us to the light and heavy bowguns. I will talk about them both at once since they are quite similar. They shoot ammo, which could be a limitation in early game as you won't have access right away to the strongest ammos in the game because you have to forage for materials first. That being said, its normal ammo is infinite, but these weapons get much stronger if you have better ammo to use. So which should you pick? Well, if you've watched the whole video to this point, you can probably guess. If you are newer to the game and want more survivability, then go with the light bowgun. You have more mobility at the cost of damage. And if you want more damage, then go with the heavier but slower heavy bowgun. Because these weapons shoot ammo, they are both relatively safe since they can be used at range, something that is very valuable to new players. I remember getting my shit kicked in by an Anjanath in the early game of Monster Hunter Wilds, and finally my friend stepped in to help me and he was using a bow. This was great as he could deal damage at range where I was trying to swing on the T-Rex with my glaive and I was having trouble. So the bowguns can be a nice option for new players since they don't require being right on top of the monsters to deal damage. And that brings us neatly into our last weapon type, the bow. As I just mentioned, weapons that can play at range are really nice in the early game for new players as it gives you separation. The separation isn't a ton as if you go too far away you'll be out of range, but it can still make a difference and be quite helpful. And the Wilds version of the bow seems to be really strong. You can evade with the bow quite easily, and this builds up a gauge which can shoot tracer arrows to help you deal more damage. And it has a dragon piercer which is great on monsters, especially big long monsters as it pierces right through their whole body. There's amazing damage potential for the bow as you get better with it, which is awesome because it's a pretty inherently safe weapon to use. So this could definitely be a great pick for new players. It has good survivability with big damage potential as you grow with it and learn all the moves. And one more thing that I guess I should mention is that in Wilds, you actually get to use two weapons. You do have to mount your secret to switch weapons, but it's still a nice option. So you can actually pick two. So for me personally, I would probably go with a bowgun or a bow for a ranged option, and then a melee type weapon. But this flexibility in your loadout is really nice, giving you more ways to take on a monster. So to summarize everything, the lighter hitting, more mobile weapon types are probably better for beginners. These include weapons like the bow, sword and shield, lance, light bowgun, dual blades, and insect glaive. Then you have the mid-tier, which are slower, heavier hitting weapons that require good timing and picking your spots. Knowing enemy movesets is very helpful with these weapons to get the most out of them. These include weapons like the heavy bowgun, gunlance, hammer, longsword, and the greatsword. And lastly, you have the complex weapons that switch archetypes and require many inputs to get the most out of. They are not the easiest to use, especially when you're trying to learn everything else in the game, as they have pretty complicated combos. These include the hunting horn, the switch axe, and the charge blade. And as I said in the opener, you really can choose any weapon you like. But if you're new to the franchise, I highly recommend the more mobile options until you can learn the ropes. And that is going to do it for the video. If you found it helpful, then a like would be greatly appreciated. And if you want more informative Monster Hunter content, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell. I look forward to making more helpful videos very soon. And lastly, if you're still here, then I appreciate you watching to the end. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.